Excellent. Well, when imagining the BBC that I would like to see manifest on our screens and through our radios, do you know what? I find I'm kind of deeply drawn towards nostalgic emotions, and I ask myself, when did I begin to feel nostalgia about the BBC, and also kind of why do I feel this way now? Now, logic tells me that nostalgia is created via the demise of the subject. You know, the beloved thing must be no more. So following that logic, I guess the BBC that I knew must be dead, really. Maybe it's simply my growing older and seeing the broadcasting era of my youth kind of give way to a new era, you know, that feeling of youth slipping away. And all the broadcasting that was the soundtrack to my youth kind of fading into the past. Maybe that's enough on its own to bring about a derisory and cynical viewpoint. But I think that in terms of a dialectic approach to considering the worth of the BBC, it's only fair to ask myself what it meant when I did enjoy watching and listening, and kind of why that was. So I've chosen two things that I liked about the BBC, and I'd like to sort of sketch out the first one and then get your opinion, if I may.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Well, the first one is, I thought it brought to us a national conversation. I mean, to my mind, there's always been something very nationalistic about the BBC, you know, let alone its name. But from inside and outside of the UK, the BBC has been perceived as I'd say a pillar of Britishness, and like an overarching symbol of the nation's character. And the role of such a binding media outlet, I reckon, has had its benefits in this way, which is the way of creating and sustaining a national conversation. Before the advent of the iPlayer, where we can now watch on demand, obviously the national conversation regarding the programmes that the BBC put out was timetabled for us, and therefore kind of watched or listened to at the same time, you know, albeit in separate homes, but also together as a nation. So, you know, episode by episode, the nation was in step. You know, soaps, comedy, drama, music, whatever, we could track the narratives together. And this was an experience I thought was cohesive in the way that it was commonly shared, whether at work or down the pub, you know, whenever and wherever small talk was required, we could always kind of rely on last night's telly to relieve an awkward moment. And there's part of me that wonders if the abatement of the ready ability to be able to have a gas about last night's telly, parallel to the rise of streaming and alternative media, as how would I put it, as like ruptured the membrane of the shared experience, which we all took for granted. Do you sense anything similar to what I've just outlined, Seb?
Yeah, well, that was very poetic, but I agree from an emotional point of view. Having something like the BBC, like a sort of home for people to check into, right? I think it helps. You know, it's a crazy world we live in, and it helps sort of alleviate anxiety. Kind of, it sort of reinforces this sense of belonging in the land, you know, in the land that you call your home. And so, knowing that everyone else is tuning in, I think it kind of gives a sort of, I think that's why you feel that nostalgia, because it, like I said, it alleviates the anxiety and kind of makes you feel calm, makes you feel at home, makes you feel sort of part of something bigger than yourself. And, you know, comparing the BBC to, let's say, that being done with alternatives, with, let's say, a spread of different outlets, I don't think it's ever going to be done quite as well as having that one place. So I think from that perspective, certainly true. And, you know, you also think about those moments that really develop a nation's collective psyche, right? So we all have, they think it's all over, you know, from the World Cup win. And if you didn't have one main home, one main center for that, you wouldn't quite have those moments for connection. So I think it helps craft a national story. It helps the sort of nation develop an identity and helps that sort of evolve over time when you have this shared thread of key moments. And obviously those key moments, the particular language that's used is really important, right? Language works on us in very peculiar ways. And so having, BBC and ITV showing the same thing, but people having different words, let's say the World Cup final, different words being used to describe the big moments in that, you're not going to have that same emotional response. And so, yeah, for all these reasons, from an emotional perspective, I really see the value that it had, and the sense of warmth that it gave in people's lives. Likewise, just in terms of connecting the nation, like if you would go, this probably happened less back in the day, or I imagine it happened somewhat, but if you would go traveling and you'd meet English people abroad, again, having that shared anchor point, something like the BBC where you watch the same chat shows and stuff like that, it helps you connect with them. It helps you identify with people in other parts of the country that you might not have reason to identify with otherwise,
Yes.
right? Or if you we're not even going traveling, if you're in London and you head up to Leeds, again, it provides a sort of anchor point, right? Everyone, it's very, when I have met people from around the country, you get talking about football, then naturally you get talking about match of the day, right? And
Yeah.
again, it creates this shared understanding. It creates this foundation for building relationships, which is obviously, that's sort of the essence of a nation. It's a bunch of implicit relationships.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, and that pretty much gets to the essence of my feelings on a national conversation. Like you, I lived in Spain for a while,
Yeah.
and it was always on the telly. Out there in the bars. There was actually a bar in Mallorca called the Only Fools and Horses Bar, and all they played was Only Fools and Horses on loop. And that's a big BBC comedy drama from the past, and look what it spawned.
Yeah.
People up and down the country. No matter I know it was a London-based comedy, but it definitely appealed to those up and down the country. And the same with the Wiedersehen Pet. A bit earlier on, that was lads from Newcastle predominantly, firstly in Germany and then in Spain. And once again, it didn't really matter that there was a bit of a north-south divide in the UK, because these kind of things bound us together, and they gave us, very importantly, an insight. It was a dramatic insight, but they gave us an insight into the psyche of our fellow countrymen. And England and Britain is a strange place in the way that it's small, and you can cross a border from 20 miles and you get a different accent. And there's a deep sense of linguistic identity in the UK. In the southeast, that has dissipated somewhat. Where I'm from in Bedfordshire, the rural Bedfordshire accent has nearly gone now. First it was replaced by a London overspill accent, and now it's been replaced by a different accent altogether, where the youth use, which is more of an urbanite sort of pop culture influenced accent. But I think that it celebrated the BBC in its heyday managed to celebrate these tenuous differences between us and point them out in a positive way.
Yeah, it's interesting to ask whether something like it definitely did that. Now again, one of the questions is, I mean, we can look sort of in a neutral way and just say, was it a good thing, right? And if it was, then maybe it's not worth digging into it too much. But you can still ask the question of, was it better than alternatives and stuff like that? And if you consider the US, would something like a BBC have been functional in the US? Now, I don't know that it would have, because I think they had a much bigger divide. I know we're very culturally different, like you mentioned, all those linguistic nuances, but I think there's more of a sense of the national order here in the UK, whereas in the US, you had the Civil War, and that has still kind of created a cultural dividing line, and you have sort of different power structures within that. So I don't think, whereas in the UK, people might, no one is sort of happy giving up power to certain segments of society, but there's more of a sense of an understanding of where you fit in the grand order of things, right? So I think that helped the BBC function here, that for better for worse, it's a society where people kind of know their place, right? If you are sort of from a mining town in the north, particularly after Thatcher's years, you developed a resentment for people who are south of Watford, or south, or maybe something higher up than that. But you still kind of you still kind of felt part of something. Whereas I think there'd be too much of a rupture if they tried to do that in the US. If they tried to kind of weave everything together, there's very different tales about how the narratives behind the Civil War and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that having a central home, the UK was, as a society, kind of uniquely well set up to do that, and I think they kind of reinforced one another. But that wartime point is an important one as well, right? I think there's some stuff that I'd like to dig in around that later on, but from the perspective of a world war going on, and looking at that sense of, I mentioned at the beginning, that sort of providing a home, making you feel calm, alleviating that sense of anxiety, having a central narrative, a central story, going through the world war, giving people somewhere to go back to, those famous dispatches and stuff like that. I mean, I imagine that's really where the BBC came into its own. Imagine that today with how, imagine that today with different views, and if there were different channels giving slightly different narratives and stuff like that, it would kind of fracture that, and it wouldn't sort of create that sense of, it would struggle to as effectively create that sense of, I guess, camaraderie and mutual understanding about what's going on, and to build the morale up.
Yeah. Well, this segues nicely into actually the second reason that I thought the BBC.
Before you say that, actually, before you, I've got kind of another angle about this question. I think that the national conversation is important for that, from an emotional perspective, from that sense of belonging. But I think it's also important very practically, in the sense that if you imagine laws govern particular territories, right? And you imagine that we are all on this land, we all need to abide by the same laws and the same customs, right? That's how you create a functional nation, and that's how you move things away from sort of chaos and anarchy and the rest of it. Now, how are people going to make sense of what a good law, or what a relevant law looks like, or what relevant customs look like, if they don't have a shared understanding? Right, so you need, I think, in order for a nation to be functional, you do need a sort of a consensus around the way the world is, and the way the world was. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to create any sort of framework, any sort of legislative or cultural framework to actually coexist. So I think it's actually essential from a practical perspective. And you then go to you then follow that down to World War II again, and you need people on the same page. Otherwise you're going to lose the war.
Yeah.
Right? And having one place, again, having one broadcaster, which is the sort of the home for the British people, does this very well, and probably does it better than alternatives than a spread would. And also just the specific makeup of the BBC. And from what I understand, it was publicly funded but private, independently regulated, right? That's how they sort of, am I right in saying that? That's how they sort of reconciled.
I think so. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So naturally they can focus on that order rather than just focusing on what's expedient, what's profitable, like sort of more commercial entities would have with different incentives, right? So I think it enabled them to do that. Now there's a question around this, which is so around this practical question around it bringing a consensus is then whether that consensus is good for the people, right? Whether the shared understanding is good for the people, because this is obviously important. Like that, given that it presents itself as neutral, then it sort of has to actually represent, what it represents really deeply implants itself in people, right? If people are like, oh, I know this is partisan media, they engage with it in a more analytical way, right? Whereas when something is seen as neutral, your defenses are down and you just kind of internalize it more. And so there is a question here about whether that consensus is good for the people, was good for the people. You consider we had a pretty good time here in Britain. The 20th century, if despite the wars and stuff, was relatively good. You compare that to other parts of the world. So I think we can get to some of this a bit later in terms of digging into this, but I think it's just worth kind of balancing that out, right? So it creates order, and you might say order is good than chaos, but that order, that consensus, is that screwing the people over, right? Because if it is, then obviously the BBC serves as a particularly potent weapon to undermine the interests of the people, in this very same way that it can help reinforce a kind of collective appreciation for the world and the rest of it. It can also, in any kind of way that it works against the interest is equally as damaging, right?
Yeah, and I like the phrase potent weapon, because consensus can be weaponized, can't it?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, you look today and people all implicitly go, well, the BBC, they're fair, right? So if the BBC are saying that COVID is a terrible danger, then it probably is, right? Because we trust them. So obviously, once you've gained people's trust, that's a power that you wield, and you have to, with great power comes great responsibility and whatnot, right? So you can kind of see how, and I think perhaps this is something to cover later, but you can kind of see how it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, you can. And well, let me go on this second point, because I think I'll be kind of treading over what we've said in the past little while. I was thinking about the function to reflect the cross sections of British society that the BBC should have, and I thought of it in terms of kind of the program makers should really be taking the temperature of the nation and then reflecting that back to us in whatever output it may be, drama, comedy, news, whatever. So we could see our streets and the people that live down them, reflected back to us through the screen. As I was talking about with Money Falls and Horses and our Wiedersehen pet, it was we 100 miles apart, but we had a commonality there, given to us via this programming. And it's a role that I think that those at the BBC have largely forgotten, and they've kind of swapped it out for you can only say it's like preaching the inclinations of a section of society rather than the society in its entirety. Yeah. It's like a narrowing of the spectrum, and with these, and now we've got copious viewing alternatives as well. This is muted the agility of the BBC. And do you know what? Also, the weirdest bit to me is if you were starting a national broadcasting network from scratch, the last thing you would do is alienate huge parts of your potential audience. Yeah. Because the result, notwithstanding that being bad business building practice in the first place, the result is that the audience you are left with are catered for so precisely that any attempt at widening the spectrum again and trying to get those who are turned off into tuning in will unsettle your catered for base, and that base will probably turn on you. It'll probably accuse you of heresy,
Yeah.
and then you have nothing. It's almost as if the engine of the BBC, to run efficiently, requires this admixture of fuel that is drawn from all of us, is drawn from society as a whole. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Well, yeah, because the more people see it as a voice for their specific interest, the more they sort of start to feel an ownership of it, and then the more sensitive they are to any deviations in that, right? Whereas if they always saw it as something that provided more of a breadth of perspective, right, then they wouldn't have that same they probably wouldn't have that same reaction, right? So they're less likely to get pissed off. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. I think that the BBC are not only in danger, but they've not only in danger of falling into the trap, but they are mostly in the trap of that precise thing, that their spectrum is so narrow now.
Yeah.
And the people within that spectrum feel ultra comfortable in there, and hence it's theirs. They feel ownership. It's very precious to them. Whereas I believe what it did have, and what is preferable, is for you to have a large audience that loves to hate you, or likes some stuff, bloody hates other stuff.
Yeah.
And that's certainly not, to my mind, what we've got now from the BBC.
Yeah. Well, given the sort of funding structure of it, right? You need a widespread of people backing you, right? Otherwise, people just could ask for it to go. So yeah, I mean, it's not really serving, in terms of its narrow interest as an organization. It's not necessarily serving this, but it's interesting, the point you make, and it's very true that if you realize how narrow the worldview that they put across is now, and I don't know if that's a reflection of underlying dynamics, if there's sort of been a consolidation in the inputs, right? In terms of people who go to university, perhaps they're being more of a conformist, because I imagine most of even though they get them from around, they like to parade regional accents and stuff like that, but they still, obviously, their inputs are very much from the university system, I would imagine, and perhaps it's a reflection of the consolidation in the culture at universities, right? That what is fed back up to us is this very, very narrow. Yeah, because it's not like they still talk about a range of things. It's just the perspective is so narrow. They don't really. They're bed to a very specific understanding of the world, and that is kind of reinforced across the spectrum, right? Even on BBC Sport, right? They're still talking about, they'll talk about Black Lives Matter, in the football stadiums and stuff like that, and so that kind of permeates everything. And so, is that a reflection? Is that just, does this more just highlight A, where society has gone, and B, expose the limitations that the BBC always had as an organization?
It does. It certainly reflects where the society has gone, because you mentioned sports, for instance. You now have people that commentate on cricket and football that are not of the generation that you just described, that have gone through this university education, which is very narrow. They have been working, for many years. They're in their 50s and 60s, and now they're saying things at the top of cricket matches and football matches in a very somber voice, like, and now, of course, the players will take the knee.
Yeah.
And you think to yourself, okay, so are you saying that because you've been told to? Are you saying that because you mean it? Or
because you want popularity?
You're
kind of just instinctively grasping at these things.
And it's all of them. It's ubiquitous across sports commentary. I think. I mean, I don't watch all sports all the time, but I get the feeling that this somber note at the top of sports matches, where taking the knee is concerned, is it's always there in the script.
Yeah, I think it has to be there in the script to continue cropping up in the way that it does.
But it's so unsettling for so many people.
Yeah,
It's so transparently coerced.
yeah,
And it just doesn't belong. There's a lot of people think, I include myself in this, that political commentary does not belong in sport commentary.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's the thing is this is a tough question because if you really view something so terrible as if you view an issue as being so destructive, then obviously sports is a platform, and you kind of think like you're thinking of yourself as a society, and you're going, are we doing all that we can? Well, if we're not having these very iconic football players spread the message, then we're not doing all that we can, right? So you can kind of see how people fall into it. Then the question becomes, well, is this big, terrible thing? Is this Black Lives Matter? Is this all that it seems to be? Is there an agenda behind it and stuff like that? And so here's where these problems again. I think you'd be hard pressed to. It's quite a hard ask in some cases if you really push that principle to its extreme extent to say, okay, no political statements ever, right? And you think about something that you believe that was terrible that happened, it can become quite hard to justify. And so I think you wonder how much the issue is that the BBC is getting political, and more the fact that it is, representing a worldview which, or implying something which is not necessarily true, or which is very biased towards certain interests, right? And this is where, if you are going to try and be this is why sort of at least being transparent, and this is where the BBC, this is where it really starts to undermine itself, is because part of its benefit, part of its value was that it was that sort of center point. But when there is no center point in a country, and it just projects the interests of one group, then there's a real power imbalance, right? And so you wonder, is that the issue, or is the issue that the BBC is getting political? Because political opinion just seeps into us whether we like it or not, right? But I guess you can caveat that by looking at the specific nature of the way they do it, right? The way that they do drop it into every single sentence, right? And certainly you can kind of start to see where it is a bit more forceful. It's not so innocent and naive, right? When you kind of see just how relentless it is across everything.
Yeah. Hearing you talk, I'm just forming an image in my mind of the BBC as like an organism with a dodgy immune system, and it's susceptible to virus. Wokeism is to my mind a virus, and so part of me knows that it's individuals that drive organizations. Organizations don't drive themselves, although some individuals will have you think that they do, and there's no culpability behind those organizations, but we all know that's not the case. But the BBC is made up of individuals, and the buck must stop with them. If they are narrowing the diversity of thought within the management of that organization to such a degree that it lowers the immune system, and then they are open for attack. And that's what happened. Look at the speed, going back to the BLM thing in football, look at the speed with which that happened. One minute that poor bloke George Floyd died at the hands of a cop.
Yeah,
that's a whole different conversation. There's a lot to be said around that. Nothing's cut and dry, but that's not cut and dry. The only thing that's cut and dry about it was bloody tragedy.
Yeah.
For everyone involved. But that happened on the Monday. By the following Monday, Pep Guardiola was on a massive screen in a spectatorless Etihad Stadium supporting Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And that followed by the players taking the knee. It was the speed with which the the BLM virus was unable to get in there, and then it took over the vital organs, and it took over the mouth as well.
Yeah.
It didn't take over the lower echelons of the boardroom, where there was people in the boardroom fighting for this new political movement to be recognized by the organization. It went straight to the mouthpiece.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think stuff like that is a bit of a tell again, right? Like that, would that have just happened organically? No, like stuff that is organic is when people kind of, sometimes you hear people talking about, we spoke about Rebel Wisdom once when we've spoken in the past. And I remember I was at a Rebel Wisdom, one of their talks, and they kind of spoke, they were sort of like, and it's one of the reasons why we get big problems such as Trump, right? And they're sort of, that kind of just slips out. They think Trump is a bad thing, and it's just like implicitly comes out, right? And that's when you're looking at just this sort of a more decentralized phenomena. But when things move with such speed, and you get someone like Pep Guardiola talking about things, and you get it across all these different, popping up in all these different places, then you realize that, okay, it has been directed. And then the question is, well, what did that direction look like? Like, is there a director general of the BBC? Is he quite insecure about the BBC's ongoing existence, right? And they're trying to justify, and they essentially feel at the mercy of the mob. And so perhaps they're kind of trying to get ahead of things, and they know what people at this point, after all these years of this culture, this sort of aggressive culture, they probably have some sort of intuition for where they need to go to cover their backs, right? So you could sort of explain it away like that, or you can be a bit more, you can sort of be a bit more cynical and wonder whether they want to divide us, and the BBC is very strategically been used as a tool for that.
Yeah, it has, and one thing follows another, doesn't it? Because you get the death of George Floyd, you get the BLM movement coming to the fore. They existed for many years before, and had outlined what their intentions were already. They had a manifesto, and they didn't just crop up. And then you get Place taking the knee, you get a sage and somber introduction from the commentator. Then, interestingly, and I'm really pleased this happened, and it might not have, but some fans were allowed back in the stadium, and you got the Millwall situation.
Yeah.
Where the Millwall fans, whilst the commentator was giving his somber introduction, the Millwall fans booed the players taking the knee. That act of dissent was widely lambasted across the media, including the BBC. And even my friends and I were talking about it, and it might be something to do with the football thing, because they're Millwall fans and they just say, oh, fucking Millwall, they're arseholes. But I think Millwall kind of appreciate that sense that people have of them, which is quite humorous. But
yeah, well, I enjoy that. And there was also that Burnley, there was that all matter as well.
The guy that flew the plane over, and it was really interesting how everybody not only put up with this fundamental change and this new parallel narrative that football suddenly had, but then they piled on anybody that dissented against it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is with this current media climate where there's very little critical thinking that happens. So again, the stuff that's implied about events in the world by the BBC seeps into people, and without them even being particularly political. And so when your average person who's just hearing Martin Tyler or whatnot on Sky Sports being like, has no place in football, stuff like that, and you're kind of, and you don't know the context, and you kind of can, you can kind of instinctively appreciate that there is still racism around. And you see a bunch of football fans booing, and you see this stuff, and you can't not view it in a very low resolution way as like, well, these guys must be dickheads, right? These guys, you even jump to sort of thinking them as racist because you're just viewing it through this very shallow lens.
There's two shallow lenses you could view that upon, and they're opposing. One is that these blokes are just dickheads. That's kind of a shallow resolution or a low resolution. And the second one is well, it's a free country. People can boo if they like.
Yeah,
There's not much
we didn't get
there's not
much.
much inquiry in that, but that's also valid. But that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Mostly my friends
Oh yeah. Yeah.
were saying that it's despicable and you shouldn't boo. And then when I quizzed a couple of people about it and said, do you not think people should be allowed to boo in football stadiums? And they said, not for this. No, I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, exactly. This gets.
So then you're choosing what you can boo and what you can boo for and what you can't boo for,
Yeah.
And that's a game. That's an unwinnable game. It's immutable.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is that you imagine someone. Let's say, you then, it's hot. It's important to think about other issues. Imagine someone, issues that you agree with, and then you realize how hard it is to, because if someone were to say, like, oh, they were sort of chanting support for Hitler, right, in a stadium, you now get to the quite fundamental questions about where freedom of speech should fall and stuff like that. I think it should be pretty extreme what's allowed, but it's an interesting one, because people kind of draw the line because they just have such a clear understanding of the way the world works. And again, these issues, they reflect the lack of consensus more than in some ways, and the general characteristics that societies take, where in order to function they need to be agreed upon some particular things, and they need to be agreed upon particular enemies and things that you need to fight against, right? Then these things seeping into football and whatnot, they are problematic. But yeah, I mean, how much? Yeah, again, sometimes you consider how much the BBC, whether they're just a reflection of that.
Yeah, I think they clearly are a reflection, but also I'd point out again that the BBC is made up of individuals, and when you get and individuals have their common characteristics, one of which is the how one can be tempted into being arrogant about the ideology of your contemporaries.
Yeah.
I mean, the new DG Tim Davies said recently, and this is just a small quote. He said, "We are far the most trusted provider of news, and when we get it right, as we did so often in these COVID-stricken times." So, I mean, that is fairly arrogant, being as though we have accepted that the data on COVID does need greater inspection. It's changing all the time. Whereas this guy thinks that they got it right so often in these COVID-stricken times. Where's the data to back that up?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's, now we get to sort of questions about whether it can actually fill its function, because, they're kind of showing off about that. But interestingly, from what I get my news, so to speak, from Twitter mainly, and you compare the narratives where between Twitter and, well, not just Twitter, I get it from just general alternative media, right? And I was much quicker than anyone else, than the BBC, to kind of think, shit, this COVID thing sounds like a big deal, right? So I was one of the first people in my family and stuff saying, hey, we should really take this seriously, and I was taking it very seriously. But then whilst the BBC is still kind of going, so there's one case and this, that, and the other, and then but then later on in the year, when you start to kind of think, this seems to be really overhyped now, then the sort of network was also much quicker to kind of start see through it. So I think they need to project that. That's part of their brand, right? As being some sort of authority. They need to, in order to justify their existence, they need to kind of tell that story and say that we are kind of on the money around the news and stuff like that. But because otherwise, you start having conversations like we're having now about whether it needs to exist. And and so it's quite striking, but I don't see they have any other choice without having to fundamentally change what they do.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because you could say that their narrative on COVID was in step with that which the government wanted to put out.
Exactly.
But That's not what we want. What we've established in this conversation, that's not what we want from the BBC. That's not being impartial. That's
Yeah,
not that's being biased toward a group of individuals again, which the government are, and they have their theories.
yeah,
Um, they could have taken the other tack. They could have said, no, we're here to represent a cross section of feeling and opinion in this country, and we're going to have X, Y, and Z scientists on. We're going to have X, Y, and Z social scientists on, psychologists, and we're going to really build up a picture of how COVID. We're going to track it by all these different diversity of opinions, and also we're going to reflect back to the country what it's doing to us,
yeah,
in real time. And they
yeah,
failed on both those counts.
yeah, 100%. And so then so it certainly seems that they are putting one view across. I think everyone can see that now. So then, this opens up a few interesting points because firstly, you wonder kind of whether this was always the case, or or whether this was always the case, whether it's more recent limitation. I mean, with regard to it being a recent limitation, you'd think that one of the advantages that the BBC has over other media outlets, right, in that yes, I'm sure they need to worry about clicks and whatnot, but their kind of fundamental business wasn't turned upside down in the way that other media outlets were, right? So I'm reading this book called News from Nowhere, and the guy talks about how in this drive to cut costs, news gathering is one of the most expensive operations, right? So what news companies had to start doing is going, okay, well, instead of sending camera crews around the world, we are an authority, and I think they see this subliminally, or they probably speak about this in the boardroom, but their brand is around authority, the news, because back in the day they were the people with the facts. They were the only people who could get any information when information was scarce. But today it's more abundant, and so now they need to be seen as an authority, but they can't do that by just spreading facts, because everyone's got the facts. The facts come out first on Twitter, and then institutions like the BBC need to do curation. Now, for these new media companies who are trying to keep up their revenues, they're kind of thinking, well, firstly, not keep up their revenue, keep up their business model, keep up their profit. So firstly, let's cut any news gathering. We can just outsource it. But secondly, because in order to justify existence as an authority, we need to start kind of weaving narrative together, right? We need to start having resonance with people, because that's how we get the clicks, to get the revenue. And he gives us one example how it used to be frowned upon that news organizations would hire experts because they would often have vested interests. So, for example, a military general would come on, or former military general, and he would be like on the board of a defense contractor, and he'd be asked about the war and Iraq war, and he'd be saying on the news, well, we need to get more fighter planes out there, right? And so they need to go to these experts to justify their brand as an authority. They also need to weave together narratives to kind of get clicks, and they naturally this tends them towards more controversy. Now, you'd think that in some ways the BBC is immune to some of these things, so it might be better weathered. But then you go back to your point and you look at the way that they have approached COVID, and it's so narrow that for whatever reason, it's incredibly inept at the moment.
Yeah, it is inept. It's not fit for purpose, and it's, for many people, I think it's damaged the brand of the BBC even more. And having read the statement by Tim Davies, who took over as DG, I think it was during COVID, but it was certainly several months ago. There's a lot of positivity and a lot of talk about renewing impartiality, and I just don't see it. I think that watching and listening to a channel like Talk Radio,
yeah,
and the ding dongs they have on there, which not only are entertaining, but what it means is, if you've got presenters who are at odds with their guests, that's a diversity of thought. You know, and if you're getting the decent guests on who have a pedigree, which you really should, That's your obligation as a broadcaster, and to do your background checks and introduce them and possibly bring anything up that is in the public's mind about that particular person within the interview. If you're doing that and you're disagreeing with them, then that's diversity of thought.
Yeah.
And I go back to someone like James Delingpole, who was the last time he was on, I think probably mainstream TV, was on the nightly. No, it wasn't nightly, but it was in the evening. The Andrew Neil news program. Was it called At Night or This Night or something like This Week, I think. And Andrew Neil just ambushed him.
Yeah.
You know, and you hear James talk about it. They said, James, do you want to come on? Do you want to talk about the WTO, etc.? And he said, yeah, I'll come on and talk about it. And Andrew Neil wanted all kinds of specifics, which he knows James. You know, he's the editor of The Spectator, who at the time James wrote for. And it apart from being a bit rude and not great telly, it was just disappointing. It was pointless, or almost, to have James on. And so he does. I don't think he wants to go on anymore, but certainly I don't think he's invited on. And ironically, they've binned Andrew Neil now, haven't they?
Yeah, even though he is still, in the grand scheme of things, he's still pretty conformist to status quo.
But I'm not to the man himself, but within the structure of the program, that is engendered by the culture of the BBC that he had to work with. The artifice of that program wouldn't allow Andrew, I don't think, to do a proper interview with James. It was almost his mode in that program was attack.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, that would be very powerful to people, right? So, given, again, BBC is our home, it represents our voice. Looking at, are you there, by the way?
I'm here.
Oh, sorry, wait. So, okay, yeah. So, in terms of the BBC is seen as the home, right? And it's supposed to represent a balanced take on things. Mm-hmm. Now, when you have an institution like the BBC, and you have someone like Andrew Neil performing a role and sort of going at someone like a Delingpole, that really damages the Brexit argument, right? Now, you could argue that, and again, here's where you get into these discussions, because then you start going, well, is there a strong Brexit argument? If there was a terrible Brexit argument, why would you not represent it as terrible? And again, this is what happens when you try and have a sort of general consensus in a world where people do just view the world very differently, and where they are operating in different realities. And again, in such an instance, the BBC just becomes a super weapon, a powerful weapon for whoever's really in control of it. It was interesting with the Brexit debate, because I read there was a book called it was about Brexit anyway, by Shipman. I can't remember his name. I was going to say Harold Shipman. That's the wrong one. And you had people in the Remain camp whining about the BBC, saying that they tried to give it impartial. It's not impartial. And I was kind of a Remainer at that point. I was going, yeah, this is, it is, the BBC. How can you give, if you're trying to, giving a balanced take shouldn't be giving equal platform to a mass murderer and to a nun, right? Giving them 50%, or should it be that, or should it actually be trying to give a representative take on the respective merits of different positions, right? And so it's just interesting where you kind of have people on both sides whining about the BBC.
Do you think that the BBC think they tried to give a balanced representative view, but they just weren't able? They weren't ideologically able to do so, but they couldn't see that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's ideologically capable so much as just like anthropologically, right? Like, that is just the way they see the world. And in terms of people's balance, people can be balanced in the way that they approach a conversation, but their view can be very extreme depending on how they make sense of the world and stuff like that. So I do believe that everyone in the BBC really does think they're doing a great thing, and I do think that many of them probably tried. I think, given we're getting a bit more divided now. You probably had some of them bubbling up below, above their level of consciousness, that they knew that they were kind of aware they wanted to push it in a particular direction. But I imagine on balance, I think they take great pride in that. I just don't think you can have, in a world that is becoming more and more fragmented because of the mediascape now, where it's so cheap for anyone to put a voice out there, it just means that there is all this conflicting information out there, and so it just becomes kind of impossible for anyone to put a thread together, to put a thread through that without alienating some portion. So I just don't think they can. I don't think an institution like that can. The only thing it can do, really, and perhaps always did, is just represent the interests of the establishment, right? And that's the only thing it can do. So it can create order, but only if you couple it with totalitarianism, right? Without, if you assume no totalitarianism, then it's not going to create that order. You compare the BBC to something like Joe Rogan, and I was thinking about this, and there are some differences, but one of the main ones is Joe Rogan doesn't speak for people who occupy the same territory, right, and have to abide by the same laws, right? So his voice is, the implications of his authority are slightly less significant, right? Even though he has a huge reach and he's influenced lots of people. So yeah, this is where it's a tough question, and you wonder whether, and this gets to a more general question of, well, what happens at the societal level, right? Do you want order, or do you want things to fragment? Do you want order and censorship and police enforcing narratives around COVID, right? In line with kind of the story the BBC are telling, or do you want all these competing narratives and this chaos? Because I just don't. It just cannot do that anymore. It cannot. It's not placed to be a arbiter. Not to be an arbiter. It's not placed to be a sort of distributor of facts, because they're always out there. And can it really do a consensus better than the alternative media sphere? Can it represent a cross section better than the alternative media sphere? No, there's no way that it can, right? Still in this fragmented situation, you still need, I think, some curation is good, right? But you need to be realistic about the authority that you provide the curator, right? And given the authority that the BBC has, giving it any sort of, such authority that the BBC has, I don't think you can give that power in the hands of a curator. I mean, there's not, given the way that it works now, there's little apart from budget that differs BBC from any other producer out there. Okay, they have more budget, so they can do more sophisticated research and whatnot, but really, when you consider what's happening on the broader scale, it can't even do that. It can't even curate in a sort of reliable way. It can't represent different people in a better way than they would be already represented. The only thing it can do is use whatever authority it has left to reinforce any narrative that the people that control it want to enforce. Now, this kind of again goes to one of my main issues with the BBC is, if you consider that every society has a ruling class, and a big institution in any given society is not gonna really deviate from the interests of the ruling class so much, then you have to kind of wonder, then the question becomes, well, what are the interests of the ruling class and stuff like that, right? So perhaps in the past, the reason the BBC worked for us is because they wanted a cohesive nation, right? Because they wanted us to go to war. They wanted us to be behind the troops when they're out there in Germany. They wanted this. They wanted freedom. They wanted freedom of thought, because the money came from a service economy where they needed people to be well educated and whatnot. And so the BBC reinforced this. Now we look at the BBC and we look at it essentially putting forward a perspective which benefits powerful globalists at the expense of the people. And then you wonder, has the BBC changed? We talk about it being unfit for purpose, but is it just that it's doing the same thing it ever did? World War II and COVID, right? Well, if you believe the narrative around COVID, then they're doing a World War II function, right? Now but they can't create order anymore because the information sphere is fragmented. But how do we know that World War II was good anymore? How do we know that it wasn't just propaganda for sort of elite banker interests, right? To get support behind a war. How do we know that anymore? So we talk about the BBC being good in the past, but how do we know that the war was a good thing? And you fast forward to today, and we realize that what's happening around COVID, what's happening around Brexit, what's happening with this cultural war stuff is not good for the average person. And so then you just wonder, well, does this merely reflect the fact that our incentives are different to theirs now? The ruling class actually want to pursue globalist things, in which case breaking national fabric, sort of starting to critique the empire and whatnot, for better or for worse, whether it was a good thing or bad thing. You see the function that plays. And so, yeah, I mean, given what a potent tool it is, it's in it in its continued existence, it's literally just serving to decimate the country. So, I think that's an important thing. Is in the past, perhaps it was just a question of our incentives were aligned, and today our incentives aren't aligned. And so the BBC is being shown for what it always was, which was a big institution to foster, to program the people in the way that the ruling classes saw fit.
Yeah, mate, some really great points there. And are we then presented with not the question of is the BBC worth saving, but the question of can the BBC be saved?
Yeah. Well, I suppose this is a philosophical question. I mean, from my perspective, it has to go because it still carries such weight. Even people that don't really see it, but even people that are kind of critical of it, they still, I still log into BBC Sport, right? And I know to tune out of any of the implicit, but it's so embedded, it's so implicit in it. It permeates the culture war and the COVID fear mongering and whatnot. It permeates everything that you can't really avoid it, and it is so potent. I mean, I think Noam Chomsky says something like that any boundaries of debate that you get within a sort of media ecosystem. So when you actually have a debate within the context, let's say you have different views, you have Fox News and CNN, or you have just a debate happening on the BBC. When they debate fervently about anything, what that serves to do is to highlight the consensus that they have, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have, for example, on the BBC, people talking about how COVID is a deadly threat, and you have people chewing each other's necks off about whether lockdown is a good thing or not, even though it's been pretty one-sided on lockdown, then all that goes to do is to, at a subliminal level, make people realize, oh, well, this COVID, without even realizing it, they are programmed to believe that COVID is such a powerful thing, right? And so such a dangerous thing. And I just think it's so destructive now. And it might not be, maybe it's not the BBC's fault. It just, I think the only thing people it can be saved for is people that go, you know what? I don't want to deal with any chaos. I think we should just have order. And I think having the BBC try and give as great of as balance to take as it can within whatever boundaries need to be set to keep society functional, then maybe you might have a case for it, right? When you're moving away from the should to the can. But if you do not like the interests that that the powerful putting out, I don't think the BBC can do anything other than represent them, right? So yeah, no, I'm pretty pretty made up on this, as you might be able to tell from my channel name, not the BBC.
Yeah, not the BBC on YouTube. Well, I agree with you, of course, but I also think there's an element of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, and it's probably because I do have nostalgia for the BBC, and and nostalgia is love, isn't it? It's the love for something that once was there, and you still feel it in many ways. I've still watched reruns of things, so I think that the BBC is not going away anytime soon in its current form, and it's almost like we're going to have to live with a gammy leg, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
We're going to drag it around. We're going to limp with it, and it's not going to get better. But we're going to have to live with it anyway. So, for me, that says to me that I need to be a bit more positive about the possibilities of a transformation and a reformation that doesn't look likely at the moment, albeit the proclamations of the new Director General, when he says things like, what have I got here? He said, on impartiality, we urgently need to champion and recommit to impartiality. It is deliverable and it is essential. If you work here, nothing should be more exciting than exploring different views, seeking evidence with curiosity and creatively presenting testimony, making use of our own experiences but not driven by our personal agendas. I wonder if some people worry that impartiality could be a little dull. Let me read that last bit again. The Director General says to his staff in the weeks after taking over, I wonder if some people worry, as in the public, that impartiality could be a little dull.
Well, that's interesting because that kind of shows that kind of speaks to the current media context that we're in, right? Where in order to kind of get any attention, you need to have an opinion.
Yeah, he's given the game away right there.
Exactly, and it shows. I asked a question earlier whether they might be sort of somewhat sheltered from some of the forces that other people, the commercial institutions, but I think that kind of shows that it is playing on his mind.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just don't. I know you're saying that throw the baby out with the bathwater and whatnot, but I just think that even if they try and they are going to do it now, right? They know they're under threat, and they're going to come back and they're going to, on some comedy, they'll do some woke jokes, right? Making fun of woke people. But again, they're never going to. Then if you believe, it depends what you believe. I believe that the biggest issue we have is we don't have a balance of power anymore. That small number of people have now globally have got such disproportionate power, and they always had it financially. I'm reading this book, Creature from Jekyll Island, talking about the founding of the Federal Reserve, and there was 10 bankers that went to that meeting, and they had 25% of the world's wealth. So what you now have is you have this monoculture that's basically, which globalization, and this is what makes me suspicious about the wars, but which globalization facilitated, right? And now you really have, and then you have this, now you have all the industry around software. So you have this massive imbalance of power. And the BBC is just a weapon for the people that control it, and the people that control it are the people that are associated with the government. And given the way that these powerful people, given the way that they have a say in who gets elected and whatnot, at the fundamental level, they're never going to say anything that seriously undermines it. They're never going to criticize lockdowns, vaccines. They're not going to, they're not going to do that. And
they don't need to. They just need to allow those that may have opposing arguments on, to have a voice.
They don't need, but
they don't need to do anything. All they need to do, as you said before, is right. curate correctly.
Yeah.
And in line with their statement. I mean, you go on the .gov website about the BBC, and there's one sentence. It says The BBC's main responsibility is to provide impartial public service broadcasting in the UK. That's its main function. That's its mission statement.
Yeah.
All it needs to do is try its hardest to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it needs to try, but trying is obviously a
Yeah.
relative concept, right? And so they might, and I'm sure they will try, and they might say, okay, like I said, we're going to have more debate around woke and stuff like that. But again, all that goes to do is reinforce anything that is not questioned and not challenged. And so that can kind of serve, I think that will just go to serve as a smoke and mirrors for anything, right? So to alleviate some of the pressure, and people go, oh no, so they are balanced now. Okay, so they are still saying that lockdown is the only option, that our kids should wear masks from school. They are still implying that is the only thing we can do. Well, maybe that is right, because I mean they've kind of now won my affection again, because they sort of took the piss out of some social justice warriors on a new BBC Three program. So look, it's not, any institution will always represent the incentives of the people who control it, right? So it's not, you're not criticizing necessarily the people that work there or whatever. You're just asking yourself now, given if we do have some kind of say in its continued existence, is it, it can't be, I mean, this is my opinion, right? Given the imbalance of power that we have, it's like if you're being battered by an enemy and you have a chance to take one of their best weapons away, you're not going to sort of, let them have it. And I think that's kind of the situation that we're in.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum things up, actually. I think we've covered quite a bit of ground on this topic. There's probably more to say. There's more thinking to be done. There's more observing to be done. And the situation is changing. They do have a new DG. You never know. In a year's time, let's do another one, and see where the BBC is, and see if the demise has sped up, or if it's looking like it's going to do fulfill its functions. Let's maybe do that, Seb. What do you think?
No, definitely. I mean, it'll be interesting. I'm keen to test some of my assumptions and stuff, and maybe they can do it. But yeah, and maybe they can do a better job than they have been now. That will still be interesting, right? They might, perhaps they can improve, even if, maybe at best, or at least, the poison will be slightly less diluted.
Yeah, slightly. I'm hopeful. I remain a bit hopeful, because the way alternative and decentralized media is going, there will be no chance. I mean, look at you and I, and the people that we listen to on YouTube. We've got a lot of commonalities between who we listen to and who we've gone to. Even before you and I spoke, when we did speak, we're aware we're in the same information sphere. And whether we like it or not, it's that, it's delineated, and we are in an enclave. And say for instance, if we all got together and we had a studio, what would happen is what's happened to trigonometry. There's people that just do not want to talk to those lads from the left. They don't want to talk to them. At least the BBC, even if it doesn't know it, has the opportunity to still have one person from one side and one person from the other side on either back to back or with each other, or in back to back programs. They can still share that space, whereas decentralized media is not going in that way. So I'm hopeful that the BBC can pull its bloody socks up.
Maybe, but decentralized media, people still serve that function. Like if you think about our side of things, like something like a Delling poll, I think it's more like you still, something like a Delling poll serves as like a center point, right? And it's just, I guess you're more relative about what the different sides of the argument look like, right? So maybe the BBC can get, trigonometry can't get certain people on, but I think it's kind of, in some ways, it's just, it's a reflection of the world that people live in. you know, and I think we're all living in smaller and smaller worlds now, so that yeah, I kind of think that you do actually see these things happening, that you do see around YouTube channels that do live streams every night. You do see these communities forming around them, and they come in and they tune in every Friday, right? And
Mm.
so you still do see media serving the function that the BBC does, right? You still Joe Rogan again, right? He serves as that function. If you want to know, like, I imagine after the election and all the controversy in the US, a bunch of people tuned in to Joe Rogan, right, to kind of get a feel for his take on it. And so I do think there is a I think there is a function that it still happens in decentralized media. It's more just the fact that we're kind of breaking it up into more decentralized tribes, right?
Mm.
But maybe, but I think, you could still argue that the BBC can maybe reach out because of its authority, because of its brand. Perhaps it can reach out across a wider spread. And given that we all still, for better or for worse, have to abide by the same laws, maybe there is a function there. As I've said, I'm very skeptical of that, because I just think that I do think that it's controlled, that it's just it's a representative of ruling class interests, and I do think they don't want the best for us, and so I can't move past that. But
Yeah, I get you. I do get you.
do definitely appreciate your point, and it's a valid point that they can achieve a broader reach than even like a Joe Rogan could, right? Merely because of this this brand that they have, and this trust equity,
which at the moment is I think we both agree is going to waste.
Yeah.
Okay, well let's do this again next year, and we'll have a recap and have a chat about it.
Yeah, maybe maybe I will work for the BBC. Maybe I'll ditch not the BBC.
Yeah, new DG. That'd be fun. Seb, great to talk to you, mate.
I really enjoyed that. Good stuff.
We'll speak to you soon. Ta-ra.
Speak soon.